That no matter how much discussion takes place and how clearly we try to define it, feminism is often misconstrued. It's seen as a radical affront to male dominance or a way to somehow diminish male relevance. Our next guest hopes to change that misperception and works to reveal what feminism can offer to men and what men can offer to feminism. Dr. Shira Tarrant is a nationally recognized expert on sexual politics and contemporary culture. She's an associate professor in the Department of Women's, Gender, and Sexuality Studies at California State University, Long Beach. She's also authored When Sex Become Gender and Men Speak Out, Views on Gender, Sex, and Power. Her hope is that by thoroughly involving and educating men about gender politics, feminism can be a movement for ending all forms of oppression, especially gender-based oppression. She joins me now to discuss how men can use their own gender privilege to stand up on behalf of women everywhere. And thanks so much for coming in.
Thank you.
Okay, so there's silos. People put people in boxes.
Yeah.
What are some of the boxes? And what,
some of those stereotypes.
Yeah,
some
the
of those
stereotypes you're talking about.
They're real easy to come to mind. When I teach my university students, the first day of every class, I start out with, "Hi, I'm Dr. Tarrant. Let's get this off our chest and talk about the stereotypes of a feminist, because we're going to be studying from a feminist perspective." And we brainstorm, and the students shout things out, and I write them up on the board. So inevitably, every semester, every class, angry, ugly, hairy, hate men, wants to destroy the family, et cetera, et cetera. And then from there, we break down what those stereotypes are. So for instance, hates men, well, then the assumption is that feminists are women. What do we say? First of all, most women don't hate men. And for those men who are feminists, do they hate themselves? What does that mean? Angry, ugly, what is the function of that? And the function or the effect that it has is that we don't want to be associated with that. We don't want somebody calling us that. And so what happens is we take a social justice movement and we attach all these stereotypes to it, and we end up saying, "Oh, I'm not that." And it moves us away from a really important social and political perspective.
Men Speak Out. Talk to me about that project, because, you know, the diversity of voices, pretty amazing stuff. When you started on this project, you know, what kind of stereotypes did you have, and where did you start at, and where did you finish when you put it together?
Well, with Men Speak Out, what happened was I was teaching at an East Coast college, and I had more and more young men taking my classes. And I was assigning books that had these first-person perspectives about what it is to be gendered female in our culture and what it is to experience those sexisms and you know what happens in everyday life. And I realized that I didn't have that book for my male students. And when I started looking for it, it didn't exist. So I literally, and I say this in the book, I literally sat down in the grass with some of the guys and said, "What would you want that book to look like?" And they gave me great ideas. I listened to what they were asking for. I wrote a proposal. I'm making it sound a lot easier than it actually was. I sent it off to the publisher. They said yes. And I sent out a call saying, "Here's this book. What are your stories?" And within a few hours, I had more than 300 queries from around the globe. It went viral so quickly. And I was thrilled, but really stunned also.
What does that say about men and their voice?
I think it says a couple things. I think that it says that there are a lot of men who are on board with gender justice, and a lot of men who are on board with feminism and anti-sexist work and anti-racist work. And I think it also says there are a lot of men around the world who also want to talk about how sexism impacts masculinity, because it all fits together as one big package deal.
Masculinity, it's not one size fits all.
Exactly.
But how would you define masculinity after working on this project?
Well, I think that I could tell you what the standard definitions of hypermasculinity are and why they're a problem. So we tend to have something called the man box, and we draw this rigid boundary around masculinity, and we say a real man is someone who doesn't cry, rock hard, doesn't back down, doesn't have emotions of tenderness. Emotions of anger are okay for men, not for women. And all of those things limit men's humanity and contribute to problems of violence towards other men, violence towards women, certainly. And I wouldn't really want to give a definition of what masculinity ought to be. because I think that we deserve to have the freedom to have a range of gender expression. There shouldn't be that really tight, small box that we're shoved into.
I can remember an episode of my own life when my father passed away. I was at the funeral and I was crying, and the priest became very upset and started shaking me, and he said, "Be a man, be a man."
Exactly.
Those are messages that are sent loudly in that respect, but also sent in commercials, ads. They're messages. I mean, I'm 12 years old. That's drummed into my head at that time.
Yeah.
This is how you're supposed to act.
Yeah.
How does that impact men, and how much of that do you have to unwind when you have them in your class?
It's a whole long process of unwinding. I think we're all participating in it for sort of the rest of our lives. But you're right. That is a really powerful message that we send boys from the time they're really young up through manhood. Be a real man, don't cry, or you're okay. And not only does it teach boys to tamp down those parts of themselves, but it also tells them that there's something wrong with that kind of emotional expression. Who is allowed to express tears and sadness? Girls and women. So there therefore must also be something wrong with girls and women by that view. So that's how it becomes super problematic for everybody.
Let's talk about some of the stories that I've seen so much in the news. I mean, Ray Rice, the Baltimore Ravens running back, that story obviously getting a lot of headlines. But even before that, rape in the military. We see so many stories about this. And then the story that the Rolling Stone magazine had about rape on college campuses, some of it discredited. But the Washington Post did a story, and I thought this said something that I thought was very interesting. They went to the fraternity, which was, really went through a lot because of this story. I mean, they vandalized, and the students who were in the fraternity didn't want to admit that they were in the fraternity. But they asked them about it, and one of the guys in the fraternity, I thought this was very telling, said, "Look, I'm not a victim. Women who are attacked on college campuses, they're victims. This story may not be true, but this goes on college campuses, and I don't want this to discredit that piece of it," which I think is a very important message. And a lot of young men probably wouldn't say that and want that in the article, but it's an important part of it.
Yeah, the problem is that we have widespread patterns of sexual violence across our college campuses and off our college campuses that impact all age ranges and all walks of life, and that's really where we need to be focusing our efforts on visibility, on prevention. And again, this is where my work with masculinity and men and feminism comes in, because one of the key things that I was really concerned about was, if I'm teaching in class and I'm talking about sexual violence and rape and sexual assault, and I'm talking to only female students, then we're on board having a conversation, but we need to have men involved in this conversation to really prevent the problem, whether it is those particular men who don't understand what sexual consent is and is not, or if they're taking it back to their fraternity or their sports team or their buddies. We need to be inviting men into that conversation, otherwise we continue to have a problem.
If you could dispel one myth about masculinity, what would it be?
Masculinity is not about being tough all the time, and that to be, especially for young men, when they're thinking about, oh, I want to get out of the friend zone, how do I get how do I hook up? I think the message often for young adult men is that the bad boy gets the girl, right? And that's not really true. And I think that by the same token, we need to be teaching our girls not to be looking for the bad boy.
Well, Shira, you've given us a lot to think about and a lot to work on as well. Thank you so much. I really appreciate meeting you.
Thank you.
Coming up next, new definitions of manhood in the world's most patriarchal societies. It's a daunting task, and our next guest is taking on with pride.